Companies must now disclose the difference between the salary packages of their top 5% earners and the lowest 5%. This is a prerequisite by the Companies Amendment Act, which President Cyril Ramaphosa signed last Friday. For more on this, I'm now joined by Kwanele Ngobeni, a senior inequality analyst at Just Share. Kwanele, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this afternoon. Perhaps let's begin by you painting a picture of the wage gap and the labor inequality that exists in South Africa.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon to you, Katleho, and your viewers, and thank you for having us. Katleho, in short, wage gaps at listed companies in South Africa are enormous. And in some instances, it will be fair to say that they are not only economically unsound, but also unfair and irresponsible within the context of our society. As you and the viewers at home would know, that South Africa remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. And we know from Statistics South Africa that a large component of this inequality is driven by income disparity in our labor markets. So the widening gap between the highest and the lowest earners is due to a combination of negative real earnings growth among the low and medium earners within our labor markets, who largely, these are the people who largely include those earning the national minimum wage. The exceptionally high levels of real earnings among the very high earners like the executives of listed companies exacerbate these wage gaps. And additionally, earning distribution in South Africa's labor market is heavily racialized and gendered.
I mean, you describe this as economically unsound and unfair. How did this gap even begin? Where did we go wrong? Were there loopholes within our labor laws that have allowed for such discrepancies?
Well, as you would know, we have been advocating for the issue of pay transparency. So, pay transparency legislation in South Africa has developed only in a few years. I mean, it was kickstarted by the amendment to the Companies Act of 2008, the process which began in 2018. And one of those loopholes is the justification of executive remuneration. So one of the common justifications of this excessive and enormous executive remuneration is usually the idea of benchmarking exercises. We have significantly contributed to the continuous increase of executive pay levels, regardless of their performance. So when justifying executive remunerations, so the remuneration committees will invariably point to these benchmark exercises to support their decision to award high salaries and bonuses. However, these exercises tend to lead to ongoing ratcheting up of pay, regardless of performance. So what we've observed through our advocacy and the work that we're doing at Just Share, now time and time again, a company will make an award significantly above the benchmark, generally justified by exceptional profits or strong share price performance. Now, as you would know, these big payouts often made are often made even when the profits or these share gains result from external factors like increased commodity prices for the mining sector or interest rate changes for banks. And these increases are then incorporated to this benchmark, resulting increase in remuneration across the board. And additionally, Katleho, if I may add, so if remuneration levels are increasing in the UK and the US, remuneration committees in South Africa will use that as a justification to increase executive pay locally. And this is justified by the remuneration committee on the basis that South African executives are easily lured into high-paying international jobs. But we know for a fact that there is no empirical evidence to back this up. However, and the fact, what we see on the work that we are doing as Just Share, the opposite is happening. As many observers would have noticed this, foreign nationals that come to South Africa to take up executive position, which indicates that South African CEOs are extremely and highly paid.
Sure. So how then, Kwanele, do you interpret the implications of the new act that mandates these companies to disclose the salary gaps between the highest and the lowest earners in the country?
So to us, there are key and important provisions within the bill in its current form. So the bill attempts to address some of these issues by scrapping the current non-binding advisory vote on executive remuneration and replacing them with ordinary resolutions that have consequences. So as you know, if you're an investor, previously your votes for the remuneration policy or a remuneration report will only be advisory, right? And we know since now the vote on executive pay will be binding, what we've seen is an extensive lobbying against these provisions by business because they know that they will be able to hold not only the board but the executives accountable. But also, the bill's requirements for transparency between the highest and the lowest earner will empower shareholders to assess whether executive remuneration is indeed fair and responsible in the context of overall employee compensation as recommended by the King Code when exercising these binding votes on remuneration. Right. So our argument as Treasurer is that, and it's a point that we're making during the public hearing processes in Parliament, is that the pay gap ratio provides a glimpse of the real world, and hopefully it will alert institutional shareholders to a broader societal context of inequality and prompt them to take action.
But now with what you've said earlier, should we then anticipate resistance from companies, and what would be the mitigating factors in place for such?
So this stems from what we've seen. Remember, during the public hearings process in Parliament, there was a strong resistance from business, or at least organizations who represent business, right? So for us, like any piece of legislation, so the crux of the matter will lie in the effective implementation. So we are awaiting the regulations and we'll see how they will be implemented. So the issue will lie in implementation and how will actually government, or at least the DTIC or any regulatory body for that matter, will follow up with these developments.
And you mean in this case where directors would then be deemed delinquent should they not adhere to the bill?
Oh, so that is a separate provision, that one. So the one of delinquency emanates from the Zondo Commission, if you remember. So back before these amendments, what would happen is that you could only declare a director delinquent after 5 years after they've vacated that position. So maybe in the 6th year, you wouldn't be able to go back and say this director was negligent, was incompetent, and probably is responsible for some of the mishaps within the companies. Now, what came out of the Zondo Commission was that actually let's increase that time period in which we can declare these directors beyond that 5 year, which was initially imposed, to declare them delinquent. And we think that will also be a mitigating factor. If you can actually declare people who are incompetent, or people who are corrupt, or people who left corruption or various unscrupulous activities, left them unabated, or couldn't exercise their fiduciary duty while they occupy that directorship. Now, that provision will enable now us to be able to say, actually, this person was responsible for this and this. Now, they should be declared delinquent as directors beyond that 5 year limit. So it's a way of holding them responsible
and accountable, right? So lastly,
yes.
Kwanele, in what ways then does this disclosure of salary gaps contribute to raising awareness, promoting dialogue, and of course fostering collective action in terms of addressing systematic inequalities that exist in our societies? And how can this information empower employees as well as investors and consumers and the society in general to advocate for more equitable and inclusive economic practices?
Oh, that's a great one. Number one, it will actually empower the employees in terms of benchmarking. It will be great if maybe you are working for a bank at the entry-level position, how much are your counterparts earning? So it will equally help the bargaining, collective bargaining agreements, because they will be based on empirical evidence, available data, right? So that's how it will empower employees and unions. It will also empower investors. Remember, I've mentioned the issue of say on pay, because when investors are voting on remuneration, their votes are just advisory. So if executives or the board does not consult them and take their inputs into consideration, the company will continue paying whatever it is that want to pay its executives. So there were no accountability, and shareholders didn't really have power. And I think now with this bill coming into effect, that will actually change. But also, it will enable to let businesses or to articulate how is the remuneration of executives fair and responsible in the context of overall employees, right? Given the context of inequality in South Africa. But lastly, something that we have been advocating for, as just shared, that we should mention, that at least the bill falls short on the issue of horizontal pay gaps, issues such as gender pay gap, racial pay gaps, because these are also eminent.
Most certainly, they certainly are. Kwanele, thank you so much for your time. I mean, this certainly is a breakthrough for low-income earners, and something that, like you say, will then look at those other pay gaps that do exist within our societies. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. That was Kwanele Ngobeni, who's a senior analyst for inequality at Just Share.